A very good morning to all the CLAT aspirants who are aiming to crack the CLAT in the year 2020. I hope your preparations are in full swing. I would like to give you a precise idea about how to approach English as one of your subjects in the CLAT paper. It looks extremely easy, however. You need to know the technique of approaching any kind of question, irrespective of the subject, whether it is logical reasoning, whether it is legal reasoning, English, or math. If you've not mastered the approach, you will take a lot of time to understand and then eventually attempt the question. What you also have to keep in mind while attempting the paper is that there has to be a balance of both understanding and attempting the questions accurately within the time specified for attempting the paper. Because if you take too much time to understand the question, it might eat up your time to attempt other questions, and eventually you might not be able to attempt the entire paper. This is the problem that most of the students face, and that is what defines the difference in their marks. That means we must learn the technique of approaching the paper and not limit ourselves to focusing or guessing the type of questions that might be asked or understanding each question with our own time. By now, you all would have already read a lot of content. However, the last 1 month should be entirely dedicated to understanding the approach of attempting a question paper. Having said that, I'm going to be giving you a little bit of a brief on how to approach the reading comprehension. When I say a reading comprehension, it consists of two words, which are categorically mentioned in the word itself, reading and comprehension. Now, what do we understand by reading? Reading basically means to understand what the author is trying to say. So that means when you're trying to read a certain paragraph, do not read with a judgment or a preconceived thought in mind. Read in order to understand what the author is trying to communicate and not what your mind is communicating to you. Comprehension is the ability to understand and interpret what is being read. The best way to comprehend is to draw inferences while reading on hidden meanings. That is, try and understand what the author is trying to communicate in between the lines. Also, try and form mental images or picture it like a story while you're reading it, which will help you in understanding how the paragraph is unfolding. Now, if you've understood what reading comprehension basically means, let's move on to understanding what types of reading comprehension can possibly be asked in the CLAT paper. Now, there are essentially two types of reading comprehension. One is when merely a passage is given to you and you have to locate things in the passage. Whatever we have done till 10th standard and 12th standard, it is more on the lines that you usually look at a passage for reading comprehension and then you try and locate what the question is asking you. However, for the CLAT paper, it is a level higher and it is much more analytical. It is not merely about locating the thing in the paragraph, but it is more about how well you are able to analyze whether the author is trying to tell you through the paragraph. So, you will fundamentally have to train your mind not to read the paragraph in a way that you start underlining the thing which you feel important, which we used to do back in 10th standard. Rather, you will have to try and understand the passage because the questions are not going to be direct questions, unlike in 10th and 12th standard. The only way you can actually achieve this is by reading more and more and understanding it, analyzing it, and drawing context rather than merely reading it just by underlining what you feel is important and then trying and locating your answer. That's not going to possibly help you in your CLAT paper. Moving on and talking about reading comprehension in detail. Now, there are two kinds of passages that I'm going to divide for your better understanding. The first is a fact-based passage, and the second is an opinion-based passage. When I talk about a fact-based passage, I divide the fact-based passage further into two categories. One is called the narrative, and the other is called the descriptive. So I'm dividing the reading comprehension in essentially two parts. One is a fact-based passage and the other is an opinion-based passage. I'm further dividing the fact-based passage into two. One is called the narrative and the other is called the descriptive. When I talk about a narrative, we basically narrate a story. When I say a narrative essay, it's in the form of a story where you usually talk about your personal experience, but at the same time, you also make a point. So, the purpose of a certain story is just to not have an entertaining tale for enjoyment, but it is importantly about the experience of the person who's narrating the stories to you, right? So, it could be based on a moral model, it could be based on a theme. So, narration is basically nothing but a storytelling, right? Now, moving on to the second aspect, when I talk about descriptive angle to the passage, what happens in a descriptive kind of a passage is that you describe a theory, a phenomena, or a concept. So, in these particular descriptive passages, the author will never have an opinion about anything. I will give you an example of this so that you can draw a difference between a narrative and a descriptive passage. Let's take, for instance, I say that you have to describe Jaipur. So my passage says that Jaipur is called the pink city of India. The walls in Jaipur are pink in color. It consists majorly of ABC population. Now, full stop. Now, what I'm doing here is essentially I'm merely stating what Jaipur is and how Jaipur looks. What is Jaipur all about? But I'm not anywhere stating any facts that I've made up on my own, or I'm not stating any opinion that's mine. I'm just telling you what the truth is, or a fact, that is what Jaipur is, how Jaipur is. So now this becomes a descriptive passage, essentially. So basically, you're describing some kind of a theory, or just describing some kind of a phenomena, or you're describing some kind of a place. But that does not have any opinion of yours in it. And it is very different from storytelling. So, this is what essentially you understand when you're trying to bifurcate between a narrative passage and a descriptive passage, which falls under the fact based approach. Now, let's come down to the second type of passages, which is usually called the opinion based approach or opinion based passages. Now, let me divide the opinion based passage on the basis of three things. First, it's called argumentative. Second is analytical. And the third is abstract. I would repeat it again for you. I divided the reading comprehension into essentially two parts, a fact based approach and an opinion based approach. I further went on to divide the fact based approach under two headings. The first was a narrative and the second was a descriptive. Moving on to the opinion based approach, I divided it into three things. First is called the argumentative, second is called the analytical, and third is called the abstract. Opinion based passages are usually, once divided, are going to make it very, very clear for you on how and on what basis will you be able to differentiate between fact based and opinion based. Moving on and trying and understanding what is an argumentative kind of a passage. Whenever I say that it is an argumentative kind of a passage, we talk about an argument which is always a one sided approach. So, argumentative passage will always be a one sided approach or a one sided passage in which the author is going to tell you the pros for a certain phenomena or the cons of a certain phenomena. He is going to give you certain pointers and then he is going to establish his pointers by supporting him through facts. For example, if I say that Jaipur has a very, very diverse culture, now this is an argument that I have made. I will have to support this particular argument by fact or by stating that how do I say that it has diverse culture, right? So when I talk about an argumentative kind of an approach to a passage, it is usually that the author is always giving his arguments to either support a certain phenomena or is going to speak against a certain phenomena. And in order to establish his argument, he is going to support himself or his arguments with the help of certain facts. Right? we come across this practice and we do this every day in our lives. For example, if I raise a question whether artificial intelligence, we usually come across this kind of a practice almost every day in our lives. I'll just give you an example. If I raise a question whether artificial intelligence venturing into law is a good thing or a bad thing. So, if I'm giving an argumentative passage, from my point of view, I'm going to say that artificial intelligence is not a very good thing in law. Now, the fact that I'm going to either support the argument or I'm going to negate this argument. So, if I think artificial intelligence is good in law, I would have to state facts which establish my point that why do I think so. So, this becomes an argumentative type of a passage. How do you recognize an argumentative passage when it is usually only one-sided, right? Now, let's talk about another second kind of opinion-based approach, which is analytical approach. Now, what do you mean by analytical-based passages? It basically means that you analyze a certain phenomena or a concept and you analyze it from both the angles. So, when I was talking about argumentative, remember, I said it is always a one-sided approach because I'm framing the argument that I believe in. When I talk about analytical type of passage, on the other hand, the author is trying to analyze the entire phenomena from both the angles and from both the sides. So it is going to have the pros as well as the cons. So you could either have a neutral approach or you're going to draw a conclusion eventually on the basis of the pros and cons that you state in the paragraph. Once you determine what are the pros of it, what are the cons of it. So, for example, a passage that artificial intelligence is not good for law, and then he gives the state fact to support it. It is an argumentative type of a passage. When I talk about an analytical type of a passage, what I'm going to do is I'm going to say that artificial intelligence could be good for law, could be bad for law. These are the pros, these are the cons, and then I'm going to conclude on my understanding what do I think as more weight, the pros or the cons. And then I'm going to conclude the paragraph. So, analytical includes approaches from both the sides, and it is not an argumentative approach. I hope you're able to understand the difference between argumentative and analytical. Argumentative is only one-sided approach. That means I'm going to only either support it or I'm going to either totally negate it. And I'm going to state facts in order to frame, in order to give my arguments. When I talk about analytical, what I do is I place both the advantages, the disadvantages, and on the basis of that, I conclude my paragraph that what I think has more weight over the other. Right? It is not try and understand. Moving on to the third kind of a paragraph or a third kind of an approach that you need to adopt when you're reading a reading comprehension, which is abstract. Now, when I say an abstract opinion-based passage, it basically means that it doesn't fall under either of the categories, nor under argumentative, nor under analytical. So that means it falls under a different category, a third category, which is called abstract. Let's take an example to understand what falls under the category of abstract. Something like a passage over state of mind, about love, something about spirituality, something about religion, etc. All these passages are abstract category passages. Neither do you have an argument in favor, nor do you have an argument against it. But you're basically talking about something which does not fall under either of the two heads mentioned before. And that is what you call an abstract passage. Now, if you understood the types of passage when we were going through a passage, it would be easy for you to figure out whether it is a fact-based or whether it is an opinion-based passage. So that means once you look at this video and once you revisit all the passages that you have in your sample papers, it will become very easy for you to bifurcate in under either fact-based approach or an opinion-based approach. And once you understand what are the categories within that, It'll become very easy for you to understand whether it is an opinion-based approach under argumentative, under analytical, or it is a third category absolutely altogether different under abstract, or whether it is descriptive or a narrative passage. Now, once you have understood about what is the kind of passage in front of you, then you have to move on to understanding how will you solve the passage. Now, there are essentially two ways to solve the passage. Most of the people, or at least some of the people around you, would suggest that you read the questions and then you go to the passage. That is not the suggestion that I would like to give you. According to me, the approach in CLAT has to be more analytical, and which is going to be a way level higher up than what you've been doing in your past classes. So it is not going to be easy for you to crack it by just merely reading the questions and then going back to the passage and locating it in the passage. What you will have to do is you'll have to read the passage like a story. Irrespective of what kind of passages, if you read it like a story, it's going to be very, very easy for you to attempt the questions eventually. Now, I'm going to suggest three kinds of possible steps that you will be possibly adapting when you are solving the questions in the CLAT paper. And this I will be doing before I move on to what type of questions can come in the CLAT paper. Now, so this particular part of the video is going to tell you how to approach those questions. The first rule is to read the passage. The second rule is to look at the central theme of the passage. Let me try and reiterate again. The first rule of how to read a reading comprehension is to read the passage. When I say read, it means reading. You don't skim through the passage. You read the passage and absorb the passage while you're reading it. The second step that you need to adopt is that you need to find the central idea of the passage. Now, this is an extremely important step, and this is where you will be able to draw a difference between what you've been doing in the past and what you might have to do when you are taking the CLAT paper. You need to find out what is the central idea of the passage that is being shown to you. Because remember, the questions are not going to be direct. Questions are going to be analytical questions. But if you know what is the central idea, it will become very, very easy for you to answer that questions. Also, I will relate this particular point to when I'm coming to what type of questions could possibly be asked at the later stage of the video. I will give you a very, very basic example of how to locate the central idea. So if people are talking about how government officials have been taking away money or siphoning away funds, what do you think will be the central idea of the passage? It is more likely that corruption could be the central idea. So that means corruption becomes your central theme of the passage. So you have to recognize what the passage is trying to talk about and what does the central idea of the passage talk about. So the first thing you do is you read. The second thing that you do is to look for the central idea. The third thing you do is you form a summary in your mind. So that means, like I told you, you have to read it like a story. For that, you need to read it properly. You need to know what the central idea is, and then you need to form a summary in your mind that what happened after what and what led to what. This goes back to the initial suggestion of making a mental picture in your mind of how the story is unfolding. If you remember in the first instance of starting the video, I told you to read the paragraph like a story and make a mental picture in your head so that you're able to understand how the story is going to eventually unfold. And this will really help you if you have to even locate anything in the reading comprehension. You exactly know how the story started, what the story said in the middle, and how the story is concluded. So this is how you have to approach a particular passage. So once you read and once you find the central idea and then a summary in your mind, if these three steps you adopt, it will become very, very easy, irrespective of what kind of questions are asked, to attempt the paper. Having said that, now I'm going to come to the last part of my video, and I'm going to come and tell you what kind of questions can be categorically asked in a CLAT paper, and what kind of questions actually make a difference when you're attempting the paper. Now, try and understand if there are 10 questions in a CLAT paper, no matter what subject it is, assume that most of the times 3 to 4 questions can be attempted by everybody and can be attempted rightly. 3 to 4 questions are usually a little more harder. For that, you need to apply a little bit of more brains. When you talk about the other last 2 questions, that is the actual place where if you score, your marks will make a difference. Those 2 questions, if you can get them right, that is what is going to actually determine how well you do in a CLAT paper. So that means your focus should be trying and attempting those last 2 questions, which are difficult for everyone. And that's going to make a difference in your marks. I'm only going to be focusing on 5 questions that I think actually makes a difference when you're doing the reading comprehension. Now, the first question that is usually asked is usually, what is the kind of passage? So, like I told you, the whole purpose of differentiating between an argumentative, analytical, and an abstract passage, or say narrative or a descriptive passage, is to tell you a question. If a question comes as to what is the kind of passage, you will be easily able to understand and determine whether it is an argumentative passage or whether it is an analytical passage. So again, revisiting the concepts. For example, if you while you're reading the passage, you realize that the author is only talking about in support of a certain phenomena. That means that this is more like an argumentative type of a passage. On the other hand, if the author is trying to balance both the pros and the cons and is coming down to a concluder or a neutral approach in the conclusion, that means that he's trying to have an analytical approach to the passage. And that is how you will be answering your first type of question, right? Now, so I want to tell you is when you are being asked what is the kind of passage, it is only if you understand what is the kind of passage you'll be able to guess the tone of the author. Now, why is it so important to understand the tone of the author? I will come down to that eventually. Moving on to the second kind of question. The second kind of question is usually more of a direct question, which is based on certain facts that are stated in the passage. So, in this particular question, what you have to do is you basically have to revisit the entire passage and exactly locate what the question is asking you. Usually, this kind of a question, everybody gets it right. The third question is actually what you have to be really, really focusing on, which is related to the first question. What is the kind of passage? And the third question that can possibly be asked is, what is the tone of the author? So these 2 questions are usually asked separately sometimes, and that is why I have put them here separately for you. So if you exactly know what kind of a passage it is, you will exactly be able to understand, or you would exactly be able to answer that what is the tone of the author, whether it is positive, whether it is negative, or whether it is neutral. So let's state, for example, if it is positive, they're going to use synonyms like affirmation, like positive, I agree, etc. When you talk about something which is negative, they're going to use words like hate, loathe, displeasure, etc. Such kind of synonyms, when they're going to be neutral, will not mention either of such words. It is not going to be a positive assertion, it's not going to be a negative assertion. And here, actually, the role of your vocabulary comes into play. I'm sure by now you people have already been acing your vocabulary. So the more synonyms you know, the better it is for you to decipher what the tone of the author is in a certain paragraph. Because it's not going to be so simple that they're going to ask you, or they're going to put words like yes, no, or they're going to use words like hate or displeasure, which are very, very simple. You use some synonyms which are not going to be very easy for you to understand until and unless you build on your vocabulary. Now, moving on to the fourth kind of a question, and this question actually determines your extra 1 mark. It is most of the time that these questions that people make a mistake, and that question relates to suggest a suitable title. You would see in most of the reading comprehensions in the CLAT paper, this is always one question that suggests a suitable title to the paragraph. Now, coming down to how to solve the question. My second point was to look at the central idea when I was telling you the 3 steps. This is where it's going to help you. Look for the central theme or the central idea of the paragraph. That is why it is going to help you, because this question is usually always asked to suggest a suitable title. If you know the central idea, it will become extremely easy for you to suggest a suitable title, and your suitable title is nothing but exactly your central idea. Remember one thing: the title should never consist of examples, it should never consist of quotation. It should only consist of what the central idea of your passage is. And that's where you're going to be able to easily solve this particular kind of question. Now, moving on and talking about the last set of questions, which also makes a lot of difference when you're trying to score that 1 extra mark. They leave the passage. Sometimes what happens is the author, or when they're framing the reading comprehension, they leave the passage without a conclusion, and then they will tell you to complete the ending or choose a closing sentence, and then they will give you certain options. Now, why is it so important to read the passage the way I told you? You read, you identify the central theme, and you form a summary, is because if you know what is the tone of the passage, what the author is trying to communicate to you, if you know what kind of passage it is, you will be able to select what is the right closing sentence. I will give you a very basic example. If you're reading the passage without actually bifurcating in your head that whether it is analytical, whether it is argumentative, what you're going to do is you will read the passage without understanding the passage, and you will not be able to actually recognize whether the author is trying to support it, whether the author has a neutral idea to it, or whether the author is trying to have a negative opinion about it. Right? Now, what's going to happen then is that you will not be able to choose the correct closing sentence because you don't know what the tone of the author is. So, for example, if I'm trying to say through my passage that artificial intelligence is the best thing that could happen to law, or artificial intelligence is the best thing that can happen to the world because it is going to make your work very, very easy. Definitely, my closing sentence would never be that artificial intelligence is not a good idea. So, if I know that the entire passage spoke in favor of artificial intelligence, and he's making an entire argument to support artificial intelligence intervention in various fields of life, it simply means that my closing sentence would be that artificial intelligence is a good option, and this will help me to locate where my exact answer lies. And this will help me to locate, or this will help me to understand what my closing sentence should look like. Now, out of the 4 options, it'll be very easy for you to know which of the 4 options is correct. So that means when you read a passage, you don't skim through it. You understand the passage in terms of its central idea, and then you summarize it in your mind. Once you do that, all these questions will become very, very easy for you to answer. I hope this particular video has helped you to understand how to approach your reading comprehension. The one thing that I would want you to do once you see this video is we would want you to go back to newspapers and pick out the editorials and read the passages and try and read it in these 3 ways. Read, find the central idea, and summarize it. If you're able to locate the central idea, that means you're reading it right and you're on the right track. However, having said that, no technique is going to help you until and unless you actually put in the hard work. So the only way to ace this technique is to read as much as possible. You still have more than almost a month to read as many passages as you can. And that is the only way you'll be able to apply this particular technique when you're going to be taking your CLAT paper. Because sometimes this technique can also take time if you're not well acquainted or if you haven't practiced it enough. So the only way to use this technique is practice as much as you can and attempt the passage in the shortest period of time. I hope this video was of help. If you have any questions, you can get back to us. And thank you so much.